What would you do if your family left you at a nursing home against your will, just as you realized you had the power to turn their abandonment into their worst nightmare? Would you reveal your secret immediately? Would you let them suffer? Would you teach them a lesson they'd never forget? Well, when my children drove away from Sunset Manor, thinking they'd successfully warehoused their inconvenient mother, I didn't have to wonder anymore. The rain was drumming against the windows of my son David's car as we pulled into the circular driveway of Sunset Manor, and something about the rhythm of those raindrops felt ominous, like a countdown to something I wasn't going to like. I'd been in the passenger seat for the past 45 minutes, listening to David and my daughter-in-law Jennifer discuss my future like I wasn't sitting right there between them. The administrator said they have an opening in the memory care wing, Jennifer was saying, her voice carrying that carefully modulated tone that people use when they're trying to sound compassionate while delivering devastating news. It's more expensive, but it might be safer for her in the long run. Memory care wing. They were talking about putting me in the section of the nursing home reserved for people with dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Not because I had either of those conditions, but because they thought it would be safer for me. Mom doesn't have memory problems, said my daughter Sarah from the back seat, though her voice lacked conviction. Her mind is completely sharp, but she's been having those episodes, David replied, using the clinical term they'd invented to describe what I called standing up for myself. The confusion, the inappropriate responses to simple requests, the refusal to cooperate with basic safety measures. Confusion, inappropriate responses, refusal to cooperate. This was how my children had chosen to characterize my objections to their increasingly controlling behavior over the past 6 months. I'm sitting right here, I said quietly, my voice cutting through their discussion like a knife through warm butter. I can hear every word you're saying about me. We know, Mom, Sarah said, reaching forward to pat my shoulder in that patronizing way that made my skin crawl. We're just trying to make sure we understand all the options so we can make the best decision for your care. The best decision for my care. Not the decision I wanted or the decision I preferred, but the decision they had determined was objectively correct for my situation. And what if I don't want to be here? I asked, looking out at the brick building that stretched out before us like a small institution. What if I want to go home to my own house and continue living my own life? The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know about how much weight my preferences carried in their decision-making process. Mom, David said finally, his voice taking on that patient, explaining to a child tone that I'd been hearing more and more lately. We've been through this. You can't live safely in your house anymore. You've had 3 falls in the past 6 months. 3 falls. I tripped once while carrying groceries up my front steps, slipped once on a wet bathroom floor, and stumbled once when I caught my foot in a loose carpet edge. In 6 months of living independently, I'd had 3 minor accidents that resulted in no serious injuries. But in David's narrative, these had become evidence of my declining physical capabilities and inability to live safely alone. None of those falls resulted in serious injury, I pointed out. None of them required medical attention. None of them were caused by anything other than normal household hazards that could happen to anyone. But they could have been serious, Jennifer interjected. What if you'd hit your head? What if you'd broken a bone? What if no one had found you for hours or days? What if my family had built their entire argument for institutionalizing me on hypothetical scenario that might never occur? Jennifer, I said, turning to look at my daughter-in-law directly. By that logic, you should move into a nursing home too. You could fall in your shower. You could trip on your stairs. You could have a medical emergency when David isn't home. That's different, she said quickly. We're younger. We're not at the same risk level. Risk level. As if reaching the age of 78 automatically moved me into a category of people who were too dangerous to be allowed to live independently. And what about my friends? I asked. What about my social activities? What about my garden? What about the life I've built in my community over the past 40 years? You can make new friends here, Sarah said brightly. They have activities and programs. You might actually enjoy it more than being isolated in your big house. Isolated in my big house. This was how they'd chosen to characterize my life in the home where I'd raised them, where I'd been married to their father for 52 years, where I had deep roots and meaningful connections. But here's what my children didn't know about Sunset Manor. Here's what they couldn't see as they drove up the circular driveway and prepared to abandon me in what they thought was just another nursing home. I'd been here before, many times, not as a potential resident, but as the owner who conducted regular inspections and met with staff to ensure that the facility was providing the highest quality care for its residents. Sunset Manor wasn't just a nursing home that David and Jennifer had researched and selected for me. It was a property I'd purchased 15 years earlier, renovated extensively, and operated as a premium care facility for elderly people whose families actually wanted the best possible quality of life for them. The irony of my children choosing to abandon me in a building I owned was so perfect it was almost poetic. But I wasn't ready to reveal that information yet. First, I wanted to see exactly how they planned to handle this abandonment. "Mom," David said as he parked the car near the front entrance, "I want you to give this place a chance. I want you to try to see it as an opportunity rather than a punishment." An opportunity rather than a punishment. He was asking me to reframe my involuntary institutionalization as a positive life change. And what if I don't see it as an opportunity? I asked. What if I see it as exactly what it is, my family warehousing me in an institution because caring about my well-being has become too inconvenient for them? "Mom, that's not fair," Sarah protested. "We're doing this because we love you, and we're worried about your safety. You're doing this because you're tired of worrying about me," I corrected. "You're doing this because you want the peace of mind that comes from knowing I'm being supervised by professionals, so you don't have to think about my needs anymore." The truth of that statement hung in the car, like smoke from a fire that no one wanted to acknowledge. "Let's just go inside and get you settled," Jennifer said, clearly wanting to avoid any further discussion to gussen their motivations. "Once you see the facility and meet the staff, you might feel differently about being here." We got out of the car and walked toward the front entrance of Sunset Manor, with David and Jennifer flanking me like prison guards escorting an inmate to her cell. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, and we stepped into the lobby that I'd designed specifically to feel welcoming and homelike, rather than institutional. The administrator, Mrs. Patricia Williamson, was waiting for us at the reception desk with a warm smile and a folder full of paperwork. She was a competent, caring professional who I'd hired specifically because she understood that nursing home residents were people with dignity and worth, not just bodies to be warehoused. "You must be Mrs. Richardson," she said, extending her hand to me with genuine warmth. "Welcome to Sunset Manor. We're so pleased that you'll be joining our community." But as she shook my hand, I saw recognition flicker in her eyes. She knew exactly who I was, and she was clearly surprised to see me being admitted as a resident, rather than visiting as the owner. To her credit, she maintained her professional composure and didn't reveal my identity to David and Jennifer. "Mrs. Williamson," David said, stepping forward to take control of the conversation. "We spoke on the phone about my mother's needs and the level of care she requires." "Yes, of course," Mrs. Williamson replied, opening her folder and consulting her notes. "We've assessed the memory care wing and the additional supervision that might be appropriate for Mrs. Richardson's situation." Memory care wing. Additional supervision. Mrs. Williamson was repeating the terms that David had used during their phone conversation, even though she knew perfectly well that I had no cognitive impairments and didn't require any special supervision. "I think there's been some confusion," I said quietly, looking directly at Mrs. Williamson. "I don't have memory problems or cognitive issues that would require placement in a memory care unit." "Mom," Jennifer interrupted quickly. "The doctor said that your recent episodes of confusion and disorientation suggest that you might benefit from a more structured environment." Episodes of confusion and disorientation. I'd never had any such episodes, and no doctor had ever suggested any such thing. Jennifer was simply lying to justify their decision to institutionalize me. But Mrs. Williamson was looking at me with knowing eyes, clearly understanding that there was much more to this situation than what she was being told by my children. "Perhaps," she said diplomatically, We should start with a regular room in our assisted living wing and see how Mrs. Richardson's adjusts to our community. We can always reassess her needs after she's had time to settle in. Actually, David said, his voice taking on an authoritative tone that brooked no disagreement, we think the memory care unit would be the safest option from the beginning. We'd rather err on the side of caution. Err on the side of caution. He wanted to lock me in the memory care unit, not because I needed that level of restriction, but because it would give him and Jennifer peace of mind. Very well, Mrs. Williamson said, though I could see the disapproval in her eyes. Let me show you to the memory care wing and get Mrs. Richardson settled in her room. As we walked through the corridors of my own facility, I found myself seeing it through new eyes. The hallways I'd walked as an owner conducting inspections now felt different as I walked them as an involuntary resident. The cheerful decorations and comfortable furnishings that I'd selected to create a home-like atmosphere now seemed like props in a stage set designed to make institutionalization seem palatable. We reached the memory care unit, where Mrs. Williamson used her keycard to unlock the security door that kept residents from wandering out of the wing unescorted. The lock clicked behind us, with a sound that felt remarkably like the closing of a cage. "This is your room," Mrs. Williamson said, opening the door to a pleasant but small space that meant a single bed, a dresser, a small table, and one chair. "You have a nice view of the garden, and you'll share a bathroom with the resident next door." A nice view of the garden. The garden that I'd paid to have professionally landscaped specifically to provide beauty and tranquility for the residents of this facility. David and Jennifer began unpacking the 2 suitcases they'd brought, hanging my clothes in the small closet, and arranging my personal items on the dresser like they were decorating a hotel room for a brief stay. "This looks very comfortable," Jennifer said with forced cheerfulness. "And look, you have a call button right here by your bed in case you need help with anything." A call button by my bed, in case the woman who owned the building needed help from the staff she employed. But the most devastating moment was still to come. The moment when my children's true feelings about abandoning me would be revealed. "Well, Mom," David said, looking around the small room with satisfaction, "I think you're all set. Your things are put away, you've met Mrs. Williamson, and dinner is in an hour." All set. As if moving into a nursing home was like checking into a hotel for a vacation. "When will you visit?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. David and Jennifer exchanged a look that told me everything I needed to know about their visiting plans. "We'll come by once we get you settled in," David said vaguely. "Maybe next weekend. We want to give you time to adjust to your new routine before we interrupt with visits." Time to adjust to my new routine. Time for them to enjoy their freedom from worrying about me before they had to face the guilt of what they'd done. "What about my house?" I asked. "What are you planning to do with my home?" "We'll take care of everything," Jennifer said quickly. "We'll sort through your belongings, keep the important things, and donate or sell the rest. The house will go on the market once we get it cleared out." They were going to sell my house, the home where I'd lived for 40 years, where I'd raised my children, where I'd built a life with their father, was going to be sold to pay for my involuntary imprisonment in a nursing home. "Don't I have any say in what happens to my belongings?" I asked. "Mom, you don't need to worry about that stuff anymore," Sarah said, her voice taking on that bright, dismissive tone that people use when they're trying to make bad news sound cheerful. "We'll handle all the details. You just focus on getting settled here and making new friends. Don't worry about that stuff anymore." My lifetime of possessions, memories, and meaningful objects had just been reduced to stuff that I didn't need to worry about. "What about my bank accounts?" I asked. "What about my financial affairs?" "David's going to handle all of that," Jennifer said. "He's getting power of attorney so he can manage your finances and make sure your bills get paid." Power of attorney. They were taking control of my money as well as my living situation. "I didn't agree to give David power of attorney," I said. "The lawyer said it would be easier if you were cooperative," David said, "but it's not really optional at this point. Your condition requires that someone responsible take over your financial affairs." My condition. The condition that existed only in their imagination, that they'd invented to justify taking control of my life. But here's where I realized that my children had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Here's where their plan to warehouse me and steal my assets was about to backfire in spectacular fashion. They thought they were taking control of the finances of a helpless elderly woman who had no power to resist their decisions. What they were actually doing was attempting to steal money and property from someone who had far more resources and legal protection than they could imagine. David, I said quietly, I think there's something you should know about my financial situation. What about it? I think you might be surprised by what you find when you start looking into my assets and income. Mom, we know you have some savings in the value of the house, Jennifer said dismissively. We've calculated how long your money will last for your care here. They'd calculated how long my money would last. They'd already planned how to spend my assets on my imprisonment. Have you? I asked. Have you really calculated my net worth and my income streams? We have a pretty good idea, David said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who thought he'd done his homework. The house is worth about $300,000. You have maybe $50,000 in savings, and there's Dad's pension. It should cover your care here for several years. $350,000. That's what they thought my net worth was. They had no idea that the woman they were abandoning in a nursing home was actually worth more than $8 million and owned multiple properties, including the building they were leaving me in. Mrs. Williamson, I said, turning to the administrator who had been listening to this conversation with growing discomfort. Could I speak with you privately for a moment? Of course, she said, clearly understanding that something significant was about to happen. We should probably get going, David said, glancing at his watch. Visiting hours are almost over anyway. Visiting hours? I'd been in the building for less than 2 hours, and my son was already treating me like just another resident whose family visits were subject to institutional scheduling. Before you go, I said, I think you should know that Mrs. Williamson and I have met before. You have? Jennifer asked, confusion creeping into her voice. Yes, I said, looking directly at Mrs. Williamson. Haven't we, Patricia? Mrs. Williamson's eyes widened slightly as she realized I was about to reveal our relationship. Yes, we have, she said carefully. In what context? David asked, suspicion beginning to replace confidence in his voice. In the context, I said, savoring every word, of our monthly meetings to discuss facility operations, staffing levels, resident satisfaction, and financial performance. I don't understand, Sarah said. Mrs. Williamson, I said, would you please explain to my children what my relationship is to Sunset Manor? Mrs. Williamson looked at me questioningly, making sure I really wanted her to reveal the truth. When I nodded, she turned to face David, Jennifer, and Sarah, with expression that was part professional courtesy and part barely suppressed amazement at what she was witnessing. Your mother, she said slowly, is the owner of Sunset Manor. She purchased this facility 15 years ago, oversaw its complete renovation, and has been actively involved in its management ever since. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the air conditioning system humming in the walls. What? David whispered. Your mother, Mrs. Williamson repeated, owns this building. She owns this business. She's my employer. That's impossible, Jennifer said, her voice rising with panic. She lives in a modest house. She doesn't have that kind of money. Actually, I said, standing up from the single chair in what they thought was my new permanent home, I have exactly that kind of money. And much more. But the revelation about my ownership of Sunset Manor was just the beginning of their education about who they'd actually been trying to control and exploit. Mrs. Williamson, I said, could you please show my children to your office? I think we need to have a more detailed conversation about my situation. Of course, she said, her professionalism masking what I knew was her amazement at witnessing this family drama unfold in her facility. We walked back through the memory care unit, with Mrs. Williamson using her key card to unlock the security door that my children had just locked me behind. The symbolism wasn't lost on any of us as we stepped back into the main corridor of the building I owned. Mrs. Williamson's office was spacious and comfortable. decorated with the warm professional furnishings that I'd approved when we designed the administrative areas. She gestured for David, Jennifer, and Sarah to sit in the chairs facing her desk, while I remained standing behind them like a prosecutor preparing to present evidence to a jury. "Would you like me to pull up the ownership documents?" Mrs. Williamson asked me. "Yes, please," I said. "I think my children need to see some official paperwork before they'll believe what they're hearing." Mrs. Williamson turned to her computer and pulled up the legal documents that establish Richardson Properties LLC as the owner of Sunset Manor, with Eleanor Richardson listed as the CEO and sole proprietor. "As you can see," she said, turning her monitor so David, Jennifer, and Sarah could read the documents, "your mother purchased this facility in 2009 for $2.8 million. She invested an additional $1.2 million in renovations and improvement. The facility is now worth approximately $5.5 million. The number hung in the air like smoke from an explosion that had just destroyed their understanding of reality. "But how?" David stammered. "Where did you get that kind of money?" "From your father," I said simply. "Your father was a very successful businessman who invested wisely and lived below his means. When he died, he left me with substantial assets that I've continued to grow through careful investment and property management." "We thought you were living on Social Security and Dad's pension," Sarah said weakly. "I do receive Social Security and your father's pension," I said, "but those are tiny fractions of my actual income. My primary income comes from rent on 6 properties that I own, dividends from investment portfolios, and profits from this nursing home." 6 properties, investment portfolios, profits from a nursing home. My children were learning that the woman they'd tried to warehouse as a financial burden was actually a real estate mogul and successful businesswoman. "Mrs. Williamson," I continued, "could you please show them the financial statements for Sunset Manor?" "Are you sure you want me to share that information?" she asked, understanding that financial details were typically confidential. "I'm sure," I said. "I want my children to understand exactly what they've just done." Mrs. Williamson pulled up the facility's annual financial report on her computer. "Sunset Manor generates approximately $2.3 million in annual revenue," she said, reading from the report. "After operating expenses, the facility produces a net profit of approximately $400,000 per year. $400,000 per year in profit. From one property. The property they just abandoned me in, thinking it was an expense that would drain my modest savings. I own 5 other rental properties," I said, watching my children's faces as they tried to process this information. 2 apartment buildings, 2 commercial office buildings, and a small shopping center. Combined, they generate about $180,000 per year in rental income, after expenses. "So your total annual income is," David said, apparently trying to do math in his head while his worldview collapsed around him. "Approximately $580,000 per year," I said, "plus social celibacy, plus your father's pension, plus dividend income from my stock portfolio." "Your stock portfolio?" Jennifer asked faintly. "Worth approximately $1.8 million, I said, "diversified across index funds, blue-chip stocks, and municipal bonds." The total picture of my financial situation was beginning to come into focus for them. The woman they thought was worth $350,000 was actually worth more than $8 million and generated more annual income than most people earn in a decade. "Why didn't you tell us?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I wanted to see who you really were when you thought I had nothing to offer you," I said. "I wanted to know if your love and concern for me were genuine, or if they were conditional on your perception of my financial value." "We do love you," David protested. "This was never about money, wasn't it?" I asked, "because you just spent the last hour discussing how to take control of my assets and sell my house to pay for my care. You've arranged to get power of attorney over my finances. You've made plans to dispose of my belongings and liquidate my estate." "We thought we were being responsible," Jennifer said defensively. "You thought you were inheriting my assets while I was still alive," I corrected. "You thought you were positioning yourselves to control my money." under the guise of caring for me. But here's where I revealed the most devastating aspect of their plan. Here's where they learned that their attempt to exploit what they thought was a vulnerable elderly woman had actually put them in an extremely vulnerable position. Mrs. Williamson, I said, could you please explain to my children what happens when family members abandon residents at nursing homes? I'm not sure I understand, she said, though her expression suggested she knew exactly where I was heading with this question. I mean, what happens when family members admit someone to a facility and then fail to visit, fail to participate in care planning, and fail to maintain meaningful contact with the resident? Well, Mrs. Williamson said carefully, we have policies about family involvement in resident care. Families who abandon residents or fail to participate in their care can lose their visiting privileges and their input into care decisions. And what about financial responsibilities? I asked. Family members who place residents in our facility are financially responsible for the cost of care, she said. If they default on payments or attempt to abandon financial responsibility, we pursue legal remedies. How much does care in the memory care unit cost? I asked. Mrs. Williamson consulted her computer. The memory care unit cost $8,500 per month, she said, plus additional fees for specialized services, medical care, and personal items. $8,500 per month, plus additional fees. David and Jennifer had just committed themselves to paying more than $100,000 per year for my care in a facility that I actually owned. And since they've requested placement in the memory care unit specifically, I said, and since they've indicated that they plan to take control of my finances, they're personally liable for those costs, aren't they? Yes, Mrs. Williamson said, beginning to understand the trap that my children had just walked into. When family members request a specific level of care and accept financial responsibility, they're legally obligated to pay for that care. Even if the resident doesn't actually need that level of care, I asked. Even if the resident doesn't need that level of care, she confirmed. David's face had gone completely white. How much would that be per year? Approximately $120,000 per year, Mrs. Williamson said, plus additional costs that could bring the total to $150,000 per year to keep me imprisoned in a facility I owned for care I didn't need because they'd wanted to warehouse me rather than deal with the inconvenience of treating me with dignity and respect. But we thought her own money would pay for it, Jennifer said desperately. We thought we were just managing her assets to cover her care costs. And you can certainly use her assets to pay for her care, I said, if she agrees that arrangement. But since I don't agree to this arrangement, and since I don't consent to being institutionalized, you'll need to find another way to pay for the care you've requested. You can't just refuse to pay for your own care, David said desperately. Actually, I can, I said, because this isn't my care. This is your decision to place me in an institution against my will. You made this decision, you requested this level of care, and you accepted financial responsibility for it. But the most devastating revelation was still to come. The detail that would complete their understanding of exactly how much power they'd just handed to someone they'd tried to exploit and control. Mrs. Williamson, I said, I'd like to make some changes to the policies here at Sunset Manor, effective immediately. What kind of changes? She asked, though her smile suggested she was beginning to enjoy watching my children's comeuppance. First, I'd like to implement a new policy regarding visitors who abandon residents, I said. Effective immediately, family members who place residents in our facility and then fail to visit regularly or participate meaningfully in their care will have their visiting privileges suspended. That's a reasonable policy, Mrs. Williamson said, making notes on her computer. How would you define regular visits and meaningful participation? Weekly visits of at least 2 hours, I said. Active participation in care planning meetings. Involvement in social activities and family events. Genuine emotional support for the residents' well-being. And what happens if family members fail to meet these requirements? She asked. They lose their visiting privileges entirely, I said. They're banned from the property. They forfeit any input into the residents' care decisions. David, Jennifer and Sarah were staring at me in horror as they began to understand what I was doing. Mom, you can't be serious, David said. You can't ban us from visiting you. I'm not banning you from visiting me, I said. I'm implementing a policy that bans family members who abandon residents. If you don't want to be affected by this policy, then don't abandon residents. But we weren't planning to abandon you, Sarah protested. We were planning to visit. When? I asked. You just told me you'd visit maybe next weekend and that you wanted to give me time to adjust before you interrupted with visits. That doesn't sound like weekly 2-hour visits to me. We could change our plans, Jennifer said desperately. Could you? I asked. Because 5 minutes ago you were discussing how to sell my house, dispose of my belongings, and take control of my finances. That doesn't sound like people who are planning to be actively involved in my care. But I wasn't finished implementing new policies. The education my children were about to receive was just getting started. Mrs. Williamson, I continued, I'd also like to implement a new policy regarding the financial responsibilities of family members who request inappropriate levels of care. What do you mean by inappropriate levels of care? I mean family members who request memory care or other specialized services for residents who don't actually need those services, I said. Family members who use institutional care as a way to control or punish residents rather than to provide necessary medical support. That's also a reasonable policy, she said. What would be the consequences for requesting inappropriate care? The family members would be personally liable for 100% of the costs, I said. No insurance coverage, no Medicare assistance, no financial support from the residents' assets. They pay out of pocket for the unnecessary care they've requested. And if they can't afford to pay, then we pursue legal remedies, I said. Wage garnishment, asset seizure, liens on their property, whatever it takes to collect payment for the care they've contracted for. David's hands were shaking as he began to understand the full implications of what they'd done. Mom, please, he said. We made a mistake. We're sorry. Can we just take you home and forget this whole thing happened? You want to take me home? I asked. To the house you were planning to sell? With the belongings you were planning to dispose of? Under the financial arrangements you were planning to control? We'll change all of that, Sarah said desperately. We'll give you back control of your finances. We'll cancel the power of attorney. We'll let you make your own decisions about your living situation. Will you? I asked. Because an hour ago you were telling me that my preferences didn't match, that my safety required institutional care, that my condition necessitated professional supervision. We were wrong, Jennifer admitted. We were completely wrong about everything. Yes, you were, I agreed. But being wrong isn't the same as learning from your mistakes. Being sorry isn't the same as changing your behavior. But here's where I had to decide what kind of lesson I wanted to teach my children. Here's where I had to choose between using my power to punish them or using it to educate them. Mrs. Williamson, I said, I think my children need some time to think about what they've learned today. Could you please show them to the exit? Of course, she said, standing up from her desk. But first, I said, I want them to understand the choice they're facing. What choice? David asked. The choice between learning to treat me with respect and losing access to me entirely, I said. The choice between changing your approach to our relationship and having no relationship at all. What do you mean? I mean that you've just demonstrated that you see me as a burden to be managed rather than a person to be valued, I said. You've shown me that your love for me is conditional on your ability to control my life and my asset. That's not true, Sarah protested. Then prove it, I said. Show me that you can love and respect me without trying to control me. Show me that you can support my independence instead of undermining it. How do we do that? You start by acknowledging what you did wrong, I said. Not just that you made a mistake, but specifically what was wrong about your approach and why it was harmful. We tried to control your life instead of supporting your choices, David said slowly. And we assumed you were incompetent when you're actually more capable than we realized, Jennifer added. And we tried to steal your assets under the guise of managing your care, Sarah said quietly. That's right, I said. And now you need to prove that you've learned something from this experience. What do we need to prove? You need to prove that you can treat me like the competent, autonomous adult that I am, I said. You need to prove that you can respect my decisions even when they make you uncomfortable. You need to prove that your love for me isn't conditional on your ability to control my life. But the most important lesson was still coming. The understanding that would determine whether my children learned anything meaningful from this devastating experience. 1 week later, I was sitting in my own home, the house that David and Jennifer had been planning to sell, when my doorbell rang. Through the window, I could see all three of my children standing on my front porch, looking nervous and uncertain. I opened the door to find David holding a large bouquet of flowers, Jennifer carrying what looked like a homemade casserole, and Sarah clutching a handwritten letter. "Mom," David said, his voice uncertain and humble in a way I hadn't heard in years. "We'd like to talk to you. If you're willing to see us." "Come in," I said, stepping back to let them enter the home they'd been planning to liquidate just 1 week earlier. We settled in my living room, the room where I'd raised them, where we'd celebrated holidays and birthdays, where we'd shared thousands of family moments that they'd been willing to abandon when it became inconvenient to respect my autonomy. "Mom," Sarah said, "we've spent the week thinking about what happened at Sunset Manor, and we need to tell you some things." "I'm listening," I said. "We need to tell you that we were wrong about everything," David said. "Not just wrong about your financial situation, but wrong about our entire approach to your life and your independence." "What specifically were you wrong about?" "We were wrong to assume that you couldn't make good decisions about your own life," Jennifer said. "We were wrong to try to override your autonomy. We were wrong to treat you like a problem that needed to be solved instead of a person who deserved respect. And we were wrong to research power of attorney and financial control without talking to you about your actual needs and preferences," Sarah added. "We were wrong to plan your institutionalization without your consent. And we were wrong to assume that we knew what was best for you without ever asking what you wanted for yourself," David said. These were exactly the kinds of acknowledgments I'd been hoping for. Not just apologies for their mistakes, but specific recognition of what those mistakes had been and why they'd been harmful. "What else?" I asked. "We were wrong to judge your capabilities based on your age rather than your actual abilities," Jennifer said. "We were wrong to assume that living independently was dangerous for you when you've been successfully managing your own life for decades. We were wrong to see you as a burden instead of recognizing you as someone with wisdom, experience, and valuable contributions to make," Sarah said. "And we were wrong to prioritize our peace of mind over your autonomy and dignity," David added. "That's right," I said. "And what are you going to do differently going forward?" "We're going to treat you like the competent adult you are," David said. "We're going to respect your decisions even when they make us worry. We're going to ask for your preferences instead of making assumptions about what you need," Jennifer said. "We're going to support your independence instead of trying to undermine it," Sarah said. "And we're going to trust your judgment instead of assuming we know better than you do about your own life," David concluded. But here's where I needed to address the most important aspect of what had happened. Here's where I needed to help them understand the broader implications of their behavior. "There's something else you need to understand," I said, "about what your behavior revealed about your values and your character." "What do you mean?" "I mean that when you thought I was financially vulnerable, you treated me with contempt and tried to control my life," I said. "But when you learned that I was wealthy, your attitude changed completely." "We were shocked," David said. "We didn't know how to process the information." "You were shocked because you'd been judging my worth based on what you thought I could provide for you," I said. "You were shocked because you realized you'd been trying to exploit someone who had far more power than you'd imagined." "That's not why we were shocked," Sarah protested. "Isn't it?" I asked. "Because within minutes of learning about my wealth, you started apologizing and asking if you could take me home. Your concern for my well-being increased dramatically when my bank balance increased." They couldn't argue with that observation, because it was exactly what had happened. "I want you to think about what that says about your approach to relationships," I continued. "I want you to consider what it means that your respect for someone is conditional on their financial status." "We don't respect people based on their money," Jennifer said. but her voice lacked conviction. You respected me less when you thought I was poor, and you respected me more when you learned I was rich. I said, you treated me as disposable when you thought I was financially dependent, and you treated me as valuable when you learned I was wealthy. We've learned from that, David said. We understand now that a person's worth isn't determined by their financial situation. Have you learned that? I asked. Or have you just learned to be more careful about making assumptions about someone's financial situation before you try to exploit them? We've learned that we were wrong to judge you based on anything other than who you are as a person, Sarah said. I hope that's true, I said, because this experience revealed something about your character that's going to take time and effort to change. What did it reveal? It revealed that you're willing to treat people badly when you think they're vulnerable and can't fight back, I said. It revealed that you see elderly people as potential burdens rather than as individuals with dignity and worth. How do we change that? David asked. You start by examining your attitudes toward aging and elderly people in general, I said. You start by questioning your assumptions about what older people are capable of and what they deserve. What do you mean? I mean that the way you treated me isn't unique, I said. Families all over the country are making similar decisions about their elderly relatives based on similar assumptions and motivations. What kind of assumptions? The assumption that reaching a certain age automatically makes someone incompetent, I said. The assumption that elderly people are burdens rather than resources. The assumption that families have the right to override elderly people's autonomy in the name of safety or convenience. And what kind of motivations? The motivation to avoid the inconvenience of caring about elderly relatives, I said. The motivation to access elderly people's assets while they're still alive. The motivation to warehouse elderly people in institutions so their families don't have to deal with them. But here's where I wanted to help my children understand how they could use this experience to become better people, not just better children. I want you to think about every elderly person you encounter from now on, I said. I want you to remember that each one of them is someone's mother or father, grandmother or grandfather. I want you to remember that they have wisdom, experience, and dignity that deserves respect. We will, Jennifer said. And I want you to think about how you'll want to be treated when you're elderly, I continued. I want you to consider whether you'll want your children to respect your autonomy or override it. I want you to think about whether you'll want to be seen as a burden or as a person with value. We want to be treated with respect, David said. Then you need to start treating elderly people with respect now, I said. You need to start challenging ageist assumptions and defending elderly people's rights to make their own decisions about their own lives. How do we do that? You start by changing your own behavior, I said. You start by treating me with the respect and dignity I deserve. You start by supporting my independence instead of trying to control it. And then you extend that same respect to other elderly people, I said. You challenge ageist attitudes when you encounter them. You advocate for elderly people's rights to autonomy and dignity. We can do that, Sarah said. Can you? I asked. Because it's going to require you to fundamentally change how you think about aging and elderly people. We're willing to change, David said. Then prove it, I said. Show me that you've learned something meaningful from this experience. 6 months later, my relationship with my children had been completely transformed. Not just repaired, but rebuilt on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine appreciation for each other's autonomy and wisdom. David had become an advocate for elderly rights in his community, volunteering with organizations that helped seniors maintain their independence and dignity. He'd started a support group for families, learning to navigate the challenges of aging relatives without resorting to control or institutionalization. Mom, he told me during one of our weekly dinners, I've been talking to other families about the mistakes we made, and it's amazing how common these problems are. What kind of problems? Families assuming that their elderly relatives are incompetent when they're actually just living differently than their children expect, he said. Adult children trying to take control of their parents' finances and living situations without ever asking what their parents actually want. And what are you telling these families? I'm telling them about our experience, he said. I'm sharing what we learned about the difference between supporting someone and controlling them. Jennifer had started working with elder law attorneys to help families understand the legal and ethical issues involved in caring for aging relatives. She'd become passionate about protecting elderly people from exploitation and abuse, even when that exploitation came from well-meaning family members. I realized that what we tried to do to you is actually a form of elder abuse, she told me. We were trying to take away your autonomy and control your assets without your consent. That's exactly the kind of behavior that elder abuse laws are designed to prevent. What are you doing with that realization? I'm helping other families understand the legal boundaries around caring for elderly relatives, she said. I'm teaching them about the difference between legitimate guardianship for people who actually need it and illegitimate attempts to control people who are perfectly capable of making their own decisions. Sarah had become involved in advocacy for nursing home reform, working to improve conditions and protect residents' rights in institutional care facilities. She'd been particularly focused on preventing families from using nursing homes as a way to warehouse inconvenient elderly relatives. I've been visiting nursing homes and talking to residents about their experiences, she told me. Some of them are there because they genuinely need the level of care that only an institution can provide. But others are there because their families didn't want to deal with them anymore. What are you doing to help? I'm working with advocacy organizations to strengthen residents' rights and improve oversight of admissions processes, she said. I'm trying to make it harder for families to institutionalize elderly relatives who don't actually need institutional care. But the most significant change was in how all three of my children approached their relationships with elderly people in general. Mom, David said during one of our conversations, I want to tell you about something that happened at work last week. What happened? One of my colleagues was talking about putting his father in a nursing home because he'd had a couple of fall, he said. 6 months ago, I would have agreed that it sounded like a reasonable safety precaution. And now I asked him whether he'd talked to his father about what he wanted, David said. I asked him whether he'd considered alternatives like home modifications or part-time assistance that would allow his father to maintain his independence. What did he say? He said he'd never thought about asking his father what he wanted, David said. He'd just assumed that moving to a nursing home was the obvious solution to the safety concerns. And what did you tell him? I told him about our experience, David said. I told him about the mistake we made in assuming we knew what was best for you without ever asking what you wanted for yourself. These conversations were exactly what I'd been hoping for. My children weren't just changing their behavior toward me, they were changing their fundamental understanding of how families should treat elderly relatives. Jennifer, I said during another dinner, how has this experience changed your perspective on aging? It's made me realize that I was dreading getting older because I thought it meant becoming helpless and dependent, she said. I was afraid of losing my autonomy and having my children make decisions for me. And now I realize that aging doesn't have to mean losing autonomy, she said. It can mean gaining wisdom and experience while maintaining the right to make your own decisions about your own life. What are you going to do differently as you age? I'm going to have honest conversations with my children about my preferences for my care, she said. I'm going to make sure they understand that I want to maintain my independence for as long as possible, and that I want them to respect my choices, even if those choices make them worry. But the most important conversation came when Sarah asked me about the broader implications of what we'd learned. Mom, she said, do you think our experience is typical of how families handle aging relatives? I think it's very common, I said. I think families often confuse love with control, and they think that caring about someone gives them the right to override that person's autonomy. How do we change that? We start by sharing our story, I said. We talk openly about the mistakes we made and what we learned from them. We help other families understand that respecting elderly people's autonomy is just as important as ensuring their safety. Would you be willing to speak publicly about this? I'd be very willing, I said, because I think there are millions of elderly people who are being treated the way you initially treated me, and their families don't realize the damage they're causing. And that's exactly what we did. My children and I began speaking together at conferences, community centers, and family support groups about the importance of maintaining dignity and autonomy as people age. We talked about the dangers of assuming that elderly people are automatically incompetent or incapable of making good decisions. We talked about the difference between offering support and trying to take control. We talked about the importance of asking elderly people what they want instead of assuming we know what's best for them. The most important thing we learned, David would tell audiences, is that love doesn't give you the right to control someone else's life. Love means respecting someone enough to let them make their own choices, even when those choices worry you. And the most important thing I learned, I would add, is that the greatest gift you can give to an aging relative isn't protection from their own decisions, but respect for their right to make those decisions. Our presentations were well received, and we heard from many families who said our story had helped them reconsider their approach to caring for elderly relatives. We heard from elderly people who felt validated in their struggles to maintain their independence, and we heard from adult children who realized they needed to change their attitudes about their aging parents. But the most meaningful feedback came from the changes I saw in my own children's lives. "Mom," Sarah said to me one evening as we sat in my garden, the garden I was still tending in my own home, making my own decisions about my own life. "I want to thank you for not giving up on us." "What do you mean?" "I mean that you could have written us off after what we tried to do to you," she said. "You could have decided that we were too selfish and controlling to have a healthy relationship with. But instead, you used our mistakes as an opportunity to teach us something important." "What did I teach you?" "You taught us that every person, regardless of age, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect," she said. "You taught us that autonomy is a fundamental human right that doesn't disappear when someone gets older." "And what are you going to do with those lessons?" "I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure that elderly people are treated with the respect they deserve," she said. "I'm going to advocate for their rights, challenge ageist assumptions, and help families learn to support their elderly relatives without controlling them. And I'm going to make sure that when I'm elderly, I treat younger people with the same respect I want them to show me," she added. Because respect isn't something that's earned by age. It's something that every human being deserves simply by virtue of being human. And that, my dear listeners, is how a family's attempt to warehouse their inconvenient mother in a nursing home became a lesson in the fundamental importance of human dignity and respect. That's how children who tried to exploit what they thought was a vulnerable elderly woman learned that vulnerability and value are not the same thing. That's how a devastating betrayal became the foundation for advocacy work that has helped hundreds of families learn to navigate the challenges of aging with love, respect, and genuine care for each other's autonomy and dignity. If my story has taught you anything, let it be this: never assume that someone's age makes them less capable of making good decisions about their own life. Never let your worry about someone become an excuse to control them. Never confuse caring about someone with the right to override their autonomy. Because every elderly person you encounter is a complete human being with wisdom, experience, and the same fundamental right to dignity and self-determination that you claim for yourself. The respect you show to elderly people today is the respect you can hope to receive when your time comes to age. The next time you're concerned about an elderly relative, ask yourself whether you're offering support or trying to take control. Ask yourself whether you're respecting their autonomy or undermining it. Ask yourself whether you're treating them like a person with value or like a problem that needs to be solved. Because, in the end, how we treat people when they're vulnerable reveals everything about our character and our values. And the greatest gift we can give to the people we love isn't our management of their lives, but our respect for their right to live those lives, according to their own wisdom and preferences. I have more stories to share about family, dignity, and the surprising ways that love can grow stronger when it's based on respect rather than control. So subscribe, share your thoughts, and remember, we're all going to be elderly someday, and the respect we show to elderly people today is the foundation for the respect we can hope to receive in our own later years.